The Hart Senate Office Buildings Committee Room 216 had witnessed countless confirmation hearings over the decades, but this morning carried an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air. January sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany panels and illuminating the dust motes that danced above the packed gallery like restless spirits. Pam Bondi entered the chamber with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and political arenas. Her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her smile radiated the kind of assurance that came from decades of public service in Florida. She moved through the room like she owned it, shaking hands with staffers, nodding graciously to senators, and offering warm greetings to familiar faces in the press section. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as lobbyists, advocacy groups, and curious citizens filled every available seat. Camera crews adjusted their equipment with the mechanical precision of seasoned professionals, their lenses tracking Bondi's every movement like predators following prey. The confirmation hearing for Attorney General was always a spectacle, but this one felt different, more charged, more consequential. At the curved dais, senators shuffled through their prepared questions and briefing materials. Most wore the slightly bored expressions of elected officials who had attended hundreds of such proceedings. They exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, checked their phones discreetly, and settled into the familiar rhythm of Senate business. But one figure remained conspicuously focused. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the far end of the Democratic side, her attention fixed on a thick manila folder that lay open before her. While others engaged in the pre-hearing social dance, she methodically reviewed document after document, her dark eyes scanning each page with the intensity of a scholar preparing for final examinations. Her fingers moved with purpose, arranging papers in precise stacks, inserting colored tabs, and making notations in the margins with a blue pen. The contrast was striking, Bondi working the room with practiced political charm, while AOC remained an island of quiet concentration, seemingly oblivious to the theatrical pageantry surrounding her. "The committee will come to order," announced Chairman Durbin, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a gavel striking wood. The room fell silent with surprising swiftness, the kind of institutional respect that decades of Senate tradition commanded. "We are here today to consider the nomination of Pamela Jo Bondi to serve as Attorney General of the United States." Bondi took her place at the witness table, a solitary figure facing the semicircle of senators who would determine her fate. She adjusted the microphone with familiar ease, her movements betraying none of the nervousness that surely churned beneath her composed exterior. Behind her, the gallery watched with the focused attention of spectators at a high-stakes sporting event. The opening statements proceeded with predictable formality. Republican senators praised Bondi's extensive prosecutorial experience, her commitment to law enforcement, and her dedication to public service during her tenure as Florida's Attorney General. Democratic senators offered polite acknowledgments while reserving judgment for the questioning phase. The ritual felt as choreographed as a ballet, each participant playing their assigned role with professional competence. Bondi's opening statement hit all the expected notes: gratitude for the nomination, respect for the rule of law, commitment to serving all Americans regardless of political affiliation. Her delivery was smooth and confident, the product of countless hours of preparation and decades of public speaking experience. She spoke of her humble beginnings, her journey through law school, and her unwavering belief in the American justice system. "I have dedicated my career to protecting the innocent and prosecuting those who would prey upon the vulnerable," she declared, her voice carrying the righteous conviction of someone who genuinely believed in her mission. "As Attorney General, I pledge to uphold the Constitution, enforce our laws fairly and impartially, and restore public confidence in the Department of Justice." The gallery listened with polite attention, though seasoned observers could detect the underlying currents of skepticism from Democratic supporters and enthusiastic approval from Republican allies. The press section buzzed with quiet activity as reporters live-tweeted key quotes and prepared their initial analyses. The first round of questioning began with senior Republicans, who lobbed softball inquiries designed to showcase Bondi's qualifications and policy positions. Senator Graham asked about her experience prosecuting complex financial schemes. Senator Cruz inquired about her views on federal versus state jurisdiction. Senator Hawley wanted to know about her commitment to protecting religious liberty. Bondi fielded each question with practiced ease, delivering responses that were substantive enough to demonstrate expertise while remaining vague enough to avoid controversial commitments. She spoke eloquently about her track record in Florida, citing statistics on prosecution rates and crime reduction that painted her tenure in glowing terms. Her answers flowed smoothly, each one reinforcing the narrative of a seasoned prosecutor ready to take on the challenges of leading the nation's premier law enforcement agency. During my time as Florida's Attorney General, we prioritized protecting consumers from predatory schemes, she explained in response to a question about white-collar enforcement. We pursued bad actors who targeted vulnerable populations, particularly seniors and students who trusted in the promises of legitimate educational and investment opportunities. As the questioning continued, a subtle shift in the room's energy became apparent to those who knew how to read the signs. While most senators maintained their focused attention, AOC had barely looked up from her documents. Her preparation seemed almost obsessive, the kind of methodical organization that suggested something more significant than routine questioning lay ahead. The Democratic turns began with Senator Whitehouse, who probed Bondi's views on prosecutorial independence and the proper relationship between the Attorney General and the White House. Senator Klobuchar asked about civil rights enforcement and voting protection. Each exchange was professional but pointed, with Democrats clearly trying to establish potential areas of concern without launching into full attack mode. Through it all, Bondi maintained her composure and confidence. She deflected difficult questions with diplomatic skill, acknowledged legitimate concerns without making commitments that might constrain her future actions, and generally performed as well as any nominee could reasonably be expected to perform under such circumstances. But AOC remained silent, her time slot approaching like a gathering storm cloud on an otherwise clear horizon. As the morning progressed, the room settled into the familiar rhythm of confirmation theater. Questions were asked, answers were given, and the process moved forward with the inexorable pace of institutional machinery. Staffers whispered updates to their principals, reporters typed furiously on laptops, and the gallery watched with the patient attention of political junkies who understood that the real action often came in unexpected moments. Finally, Chairman Dobbins' voice cut through the measured calm. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. For the first time all morning, AOC looked up from her documents. Her gaze swept across the room before settling on Bondi with laser-like focus. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air pressure drops and every creature senses approaching change. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," AOC said, her voice carrying a different quality than the collegial tones that had characterized the morning's proceedings. "Ms. Bondi, I'd like to begin by discussing your understanding of ethics in law enforcement." The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in AOC's delivery caused Bondi to straighten slightly in her chair. The practiced smile remained in place, but her eyes sharpened with newfound wariness. "Certainly, Congresswoman," Bondi replied, her voice maintaining its smooth professionalism. "Ethics are the foundation of everything we do in law enforcement. The public trust depends on our commitment to fairness, impartiality, and the rule of law." AOC nodded slowly, as if considering this response with great care. "That's interesting. So you would agree that the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as actual impropriety?" "Absolutely. We must not only act ethically, but be seen to act ethically." "And would you agree that prosecutors have a special obligation to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest?" Bondi's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Of course. The integrity of our justice system depends on public confidence in our impartiality." AOC leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes never leaving Bondi's face. "Let's explore that concept with a hypothetical scenario, shall we? Suppose a prosecutor's office received complaints about an educational institution that was allegedly defrauding students. And suppose that during the investigation, the institution's leadership made significant financial contributions to the prosecutor's political campaign. How should that prosecutor handle such a situation?" The room's energy shifted again, more noticeably this time. Reporters looked up from their laptops, senators leaned forward in their chairs, and the gallery's attention focused with new intensity on the unfolding exchange. Bondi's response came more slowly this time, her voice carrying a note of caution. "Any prosecutor would need to carefully consider all relevant factors, including the timing of events, the nature of any contributions, and whether there were legitimate grounds for recusal or other appropriate actions." "But surely," AOC pressed, "the ethical course would be clear. Either return the contribution or recuse oneself from the investigation to avoid any appearance of impropriety. These situations can be complex, Congresswoman. Each case must be evaluated on its own merits, taking into account all relevant legal and ethical considerations. AOC nodded again, but her expression suggested she found this answer unsatisfying. She glanced down at her documents, flipping to a new section with deliberate slowness that seemed to stretch time itself. The room had grown noticeably quieter, the earlier casual atmosphere replaced by something more focused and intense. Even senators who had been checking their phones now watched the exchange with undivided attention. "Ms. Bondi," AOC said finally, her voice carrying a new edge that cut through the chamber's stillness like a blade, "let's move beyond hypothetical scenarios to something completely specific." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. "Are you familiar with an institution called Trump University?" The effect was immediate and electric. Bondi's carefully maintained composure cracked for just an instant, a flash of recognition and alarm that crossed her features before the professional mask snapped back into place. But that moment was enough. The room erupted in a susurrus of whispered conversations as reporters recognized the significance of the question and senators suddenly understood that the morning's polite proceedings had been mere prologue. Camera lenses swiveled toward Bondi like weapons finding their target. Her hands, which had rested calmly on the table throughout the morning, now gripped the edge slightly. The confident smile that had carried her through hours of questioning wavered like a flame in an unexpected breeze. In that instant, everyone in the room understood that the real hearing was about to begin. The silence that followed AOC's question about Trump University stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Bondi's face had gone through a kaleidoscope of expressions in that single moment: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally a forced attempt at composure that fooled no one in the room. "Trump University," Bondi repeated, her voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "Yes, Congresswoman, am familiar with that matter. It was resolved years ago through the legal process. I'm not sure how it relates to my nomination for Attorney General." AOC's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I think it's very relevant, Ms. Bondi. In fact, I think it goes to the heart of your qualifications for this position." She reached for the thick manila folder that had been her silent companion all morning, opening it with the deliberate care of someone unveiling a masterpiece. "You see, Ms. Bondi, while Trump University was indeed resolved, as you put it, the manner of that resolution raises some fascinating questions about your understanding of prosecutorial ethics." The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What had been a routine confirmation hearing moments before now felt like a courtroom drama, with AOC as the prosecutor and Bondi suddenly cast in the unfamiliar role of defendant. Republican senators exchanged worried glances, while their Democratic colleagues leaned forward with barely concealed anticipation. AOC lifted a document from her folder, holding it up so the cameras could capture the official letterhead. "This is a complaint filed with the Florida Attorney General's office in September 2013, alleging fraudulent practices by Trump University. Were you aware of this complaint, Ms. Bondi?" Bondi's throat worked as she swallowed hard. "Congresswoman, my office received many complaints during my tenure. I cannot be expected to remember every single but this wasn't just any complaint," AOC interrupted smoothly. "This was a complaint about an institution that had already been sued in multiple states for defrauding students out of thousands of dollars. An institution whose practices were so questionable that the New York Attorney General called it a bait-and-switch scheme. Surely that would have crossed her desk?" The color was beginning to drain from Bondi's face, but she maintained her defensive posture. "If there were legitimate complaints, my office would have reviewed them according to our standard procedures." "Standard procedures?" AOC repeated, as if tasting the words. "Let's talk about those procedures, shall we?" She lifted another document, this one bearing what appeared to be an internal memo. "According to your office's own records, a preliminary review of the Trump University complaints began in October 2013. Is that correct?" Bondi shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I would have to review the specific documentation to confirm those dates." "Oh, don't worry about reviewing anything, Ms. Bondi. I've done the reviewing for you." AOC's voice carried a steely edge that sent a chill through the chamber. "October 15th, 2013, your office begins preliminary review of Trump University complaints. October 22nd, 2013, your staff requests additional documentation from complainants. November 3rd, 2013, a scheduled meeting with consumer protection staff to discuss next steps. With each date, Bondi seemed to shrink further into her chair. The confident prosecutor who had entered the hearing that morning was being replaced by someone who looked increasingly like a cornered animal. But then something interesting happens, AOC continued, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made it more menacing. November 17, 2013, the Trump Foundation makes a $25,000 contribution to your re-election campaign. And December 4, 2013, just 17 days later, the Florida Attorney General's office announces it will not pursue the Trump University investigation. The room erupted. Reporters frantically typed on their phones and laptops, trying to capture every word. In the gallery, supporters and opponents of the nomination buzzed with excitement and outrage. Chairman Durbin banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the damage was done. The timeline hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Ms. Bondi, AOC said once the noise had died down, how do you explain this remarkable coincidence of timing? Bondi's composure finally cracked completely. Congresswoman, you're implying something that simply isn't true. The timing of that contribution had nothing to do with our decision regarding the Trump University matter. These were separate issues handled by different departments. Different departments? AOC's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Ms. Bondi, you are the Attorney General. The buck stops with you, doesn't it? Are you telling this committee that you weren't aware of both the investigation and the campaign contribution? That is to say, there are proper firewalls between campaign activities and prosecutorial decisions. Firewalls that apparently failed spectacularly, AOC said dryly. She turned to a fresh page in her folder. But perhaps this was just an isolated incident. Let's examine your post-Florida career, shall we? Bondi's face went from pale to gray. She seemed to understand that AOC wasn't finished, she was just getting started. After leaving the Florida Attorney General's office in 2019, you became a lobbyist here in Washington, D.C. Is that correct? Yes, I worked for Ballard Partners, a respected lobbying firm. Respected, AOC mused. And who were some of your clients during your time there? Bondi hesitated, clearly sensing another trap. We represented various companies and organizations with legitimate business before federal agencies. Various companies, AOC repeated, including foreign governments, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms. Companies that, ironically, your future boss had spent years criticizing during his campaign speeches about draining the swamp. The phrase hit the room like a physical blow. Even Republican senators winced at the reference to one of their leaders' most famous campaign promises. Ms. Bondi, AOC continued relentlessly, isn't it true that after helping shield Donald Trump from potential prosecution in Florida, you were rewarded with lucrative lobbying opportunities representing the very kinds of interests he publicly claimed to oppose? Congresswoman, I resent the implication. It's not an implication, Ms. Bondi. It's a pattern. AOC's voice rose slightly, and for the first time, genuine anger flashed in her eyes. A pattern of behavior that shows a troubling willingness to use public office for personal gain. Bondi finally found her fighting spirit, or perhaps her desperation drove her to counterattack. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, with all due respect, you're very young and perhaps don't understand how the real world works. I have spent decades serving the people of Florida and this country with integrity and honor. I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who has never held executive office or made the kinds of difficult decisions that attorneys general face every day. The insult landed with a dull thud in the suddenly silent chamber. It was exactly the wrong thing to say, and everyone in the room knew it instantly. AOC's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that suggested Bondi had just made a fatal error. You're absolutely right about one thing, Ms. Bondi, AOC said, her voice now deadly calm. I am young. Young enough to believe that public service should actually serve the public, not the highest bidder. Young enough to think that prosecutors should prosecute fraud, not ignore it in exchange for campaign contributions. Young enough to believe that the appearance of corruption is just as damaging to our democracy as corruption itself. She stood up slowly, the motion drawing every eye in the chamber. The gesture transformed her from questioner to prosecutor, delivering a closing argument. Ms. Bondi, you've spent this morning talking about your commitment to law and order, your dedication to justice, your promise to serve all Americans. But your record tells a different story. It tells the story of someone who understood the price of protection and was willing to accept payment in full. Bondi started to respond, But AOC continued without pause. The American people deserve an attorney general who understands the difference between justice and the highest bidder. They deserve someone who will pursue wrongdoing regardless of the political or financial connections of the wrongdoer. They deserve someone whose first instinct is to protect vulnerable citizens, not powerful donors. AOC placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward slightly, her gaze boring into Bondi with laser intensity. Your record, Ms. Bondi, shows a pattern of choosing personal advancement over public service. From the Trump University matter to your subsequent lobbying career, you have consistently chosen the path that benefited Pam Bondi rather than the people you were sworn to protect. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Even the reporters had stopped typing, mesmerized by the raw power of AOC's words. I cannot in good conscience support a nomination that represents everything that is wrong with our political system. The American people deserve better than an attorney general whose loyalty can be purchased for the price of a campaign contribution. AOC glanced at her watch and then at Chairman Durbin. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. She sat down and calmly began organizing her papers, as if she had just concluded a routine budget discussion rather than delivered what would undoubtedly be remembered as one of the most devastating takedowns in confirmation hearing history. Bondi remained frozen at the witness table, her mouth slightly open, looking like someone who had just been struck by lightning. The confident prosecutor who had entered the chamber that morning was gone, replaced by someone who clearly understood that her nomination, and perhaps her entire career, was in ruins. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Chairman Durbin found his voice. The committee will stand in recess, he announced, his words barely audible above the sudden explosion of activity in the chamber. Reporters scrambled for the exits, phones pressed to their ears as they raced to file stories that would dominate the news cycle for days. In the gallery, spectators buzzed with excitement and disbelief, their conversations creating a wall of sound that filled the suddenly chaotic chamber. Social media exploded instantly. Clips of AOC's systematic dismantling of Bondi's defense began circulating within minutes, shared and reshared by millions of users who recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary. The hashtags #BondiDestroyed and #AOCReceipts began trending almost immediately, accompanied by an avalanche of commentary and analysis. Political operatives from both parties huddled in urgent conversations, already calculating the impact on the confirmation vote and future nominations. Democratic strategists barely concealed their glee at the devastating performance, while Republican allies scrambled to develop damage control strategies. But in the eye of this hurricane sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, calmly packing her documents into their manila folder as if nothing unusual had happened. She had come to the hearing prepared for this moment, armed with facts and timeline that painted an unmistakable picture of corruption and self-interest. As she finally stood to leave, AOC caught sight of Bondi still sitting at the witness table, surrounded by staffers trying to provide comfort and counsel. For just a moment, their eyes met across the chaos of the chamber. Bondi's expression mixed disbelief with something that might have been respect for the thoroughness of her destruction. AOC offered no sympathy, no conciliatory gesture. She had done her job exactly as she had planned, methodically, thoroughly, and with devastating effectiveness. The American people would have all the information they needed to judge whether Pam Bondi deserved to serve as their attorney general. The hearing would continue, other senators would ask their questions, and the formal process would run its course. But everyone in that chamber understood that the real verdict had already been delivered with surgical precision by a young congresswoman who had done her homework and wasn't afraid to present the evidence. As AOC walked toward the exit, she passed clusters of reporters and political observers, all trying to process what they had just witnessed. She moved through them with quiet confidence, knowing that the clips and quotes from the hearing would speak for themselves. The confirmation process would continue, but the trajectory had been fundamentally altered. In the span of 15 minutes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had transformed a routine political exercise into a masterclass in accountability, demonstrating that even the most powerful figures could be held responsible for their actions when confronted with meticulous preparation and unwavering principle. The reverberations would continue for days, weeks, and perhaps years. But in that moment, walking out of the Hart Senate office building into the crisp January air, AOC had achieved something remarkable. She had used the power of facts, the force of moral clarity, and the platform of public service to demand the kind of accountability that democracy requires. Behind her, the chaos continued, but ahead lay the satisfaction of a job well done, and the knowledge that the American people had seen their government work exactly as it was supposed to work when someone cared enough to ask the right questions and demand honest answers.